you know, we're close enough to the union, we know enough people that we get all these off-the-record comments that I guess I can't repeat because they're off the record, but I can say that the way in which this was structured publicly was done in a very particular way to minimize any possibility that legal sanction could be taken. I'll just leave it at that. And that's to be expected. That's what a good leader should do. And what's more, there's a large contingent of rank and file members in the ILWU who have long been opposed to the Iraq War and have taken action on their own, or maybe not official ILWU action, but done so elsewhere. So the demand within the union for action of this sort has been there since day one, and this was the chance for the union to take action on it. But going into contract negotiations, this issue I think probably came up day one of contract negotiations. We will now, remove any pending NLRB or legal or other types of statements in exchange for continuing contract negotiations. So the idea that it's that costly may be a slight overstatement, but I don't think it's that big of an overstatement. And if you look historically, this one example that may be the case, but if you look back at, for example, stopping shipping iron to Japan in the 1938, 1939, that's a much different story. The union was in a much weaker position, and they shut down all managers reports for this. The work could have gone elsewhere at that time as well. So for this, the amount of costliness might vary across these strikes, and that's taken as a good criticism. This notion of repeated gains also is clearly what's going on. If you're going to analyze a bargaining pair over time, clearly this is a repeated gain. So if you took a 1-year slice, even then, it's each one of those bargaining pairs embedded in a repeated gain. And we think this is one way to get us out of some of the unattractive mathematical properties of the equilibrium, and that has to do with the beliefs and so forth of the different members. So if you do believe that this uncertainty varies over time through some sort of random walk process, you'll still end up at some points where you might be more uncertain than at other points. Or more directly related to the issue at hand, we think that there's strong reasons to believe that there are certain things that would make the employer doubt the strength of the union, whereas other times they may not. So for example, the bringing in of a brand new president may make the employer doubt whether or not the union is capable of negotiating. So this is what happened in 2002. They had a brand new president at that point negotiating, and this 2008 also a new one. The last major coastwise strike for the ILWUs in 1971, which is basically kind of the final it's kind of the last stage of Harry Bridges' presidency. It was clear at that point that the union was actually internally very fragmented. They were unable to mount any sort of prior political actions. And so if you want to look at it more, it's a demonstration of their ability to coordinate and work together and go along with what the leader is asking them to do, even in a situation where it's not in their obvious interest. I still think that general flavor of logic is kind of what we're getting at. Did I answer all the questions? Kent and then Miriam and people I don't recognize. Sorry.
Well, I'm really interested in your research. I'm looking forward to seeing the paper. I've done a lot of work with ILWU over many years, and ILWU is such an odd union in so many ways, both in terms of its left and militant history, the fact that there's a huge split in the AFL-CIO. Most of the more progressive unions go with Change to Win. ILWU stays with the AFL-CIO. The fact that the ILWU, because of their global nature and their industry, they have much more regular contacts with the global labor movement than the vast majority of other US unions. The fact that they have an incredibly high-paid workforce. The fact that they are in a strategic industry that it makes a difference when they go out on strike, even for one day. And the fact that Taft-Hartley was invoked during the last work stoppage, and it had not been used by a president for decades. I mean, these are all things that make ILWU just fascinating, different case study to look at the nature of these work stoppages. It's a highly democratic union. It's a highly dysfunctional union. I mean, the way that they're structured, Hawaii is the largest local of the ILWU, and there's a whole different historical and cultural set of reasons that Hawaii does the things that they do. There's historic battles between San Francisco and LA locals. So there's so many variables that we're dealing with here. You know, I'm actually less interested in the data that you put together about, you know, all of these checklists, and more about kind of a real thoughtful analysis of what took place during this, you know, last strike and the players, and, you know, because it's so different between McElrath, between Arian, between, you know, Brian McFadden before that. I mean, the players are different. You know, the unions are going through all these bizarre internal battles with, you know, different left factions fighting each other within the union.
Yeah.
So I just think that those types of more descriptive stories about what is going on within the ILWU in the broader context of left politics and in the broader context of, you know, globalization and economic forces on the union, I think that's really where there would be rich lessons in terms of the research. And I'm just concerned about the checklist, of kind of going through all of these different factors, because there's, you know, the union was not the same as it was under Harry Bridges, as it was in the 60s, as it is today. So,
right. And so I think actually that's, I mean, we were able to ask this question in the way we did because we already had some of the knowledge that you're describing.
mm-hmm.
So clearly there's lessons to be learned and information to be gleaned from that. But what we actually think is almost more powerful is that we know all these changes are taking place. We know that the union has all the problems and attributes and virtues that you're describing, but they're still, it seems at least, they're still able to maintain this level of militancy on these types of issues from time to time across this entire time period. So from the 40s, from the 50s until now, under different presidents, with more or less dysfunctional people at different points in time, with different things going on the left, with different things happening at the AFL level, and all these variables and the whole rest of the world changing, is there still some sort of consistent relationship here going on? That is to say, yeah, the union is dysfunctional, but maybe they're able to pull it together around contracts every time because they know that if they can do it, they'll keep winning. Even when they weren't as well paid as they are now, or even when Hawaii wasn't fully a part of the union, or even when San Pedro wasn't as branched off, or maybe more branched off than it is now. You know, all these types of things that are clearly occurring within the union. So I don't think that there is in any way a conflict between the two, but I think by doing the work this way and trying to set it out over a longer time frame, in a more abstract setting, taking away or ignoring or trying to do our best to control for these other sets of issues that are imperfect as they may be, I still think we're able to generate
Hope you guys raise again.
You can turn it.
I still think there's a more general lesson to be learned there. And then what's more, we're trying to speak to a broader audience with this type of argument that may not be directly interested in what happened in the ILWU internal politics in 2008 or 1998 or 1938. Each one of which has its own independent and interesting and valuable story as well. So ideally, we'd like to be able to marry the two of them and say, here's a story we've learned about all the different politics that occurred in 2008 around this particular work stoppage. Here's what some people have said about how why this is going on. Does this happen in more than just 2008 in the ILWU? I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, I have one question that I want to ask two ways, and follow up on Dan's question. I mean, I want to ask it across space and across time. So, if political strikes are strategic for showing that you're strong and extracting more in a contract negotiation, why don't all unions in the U.S. use them? And the other question I want to ask is the plus time one. The strike record in Europe over the last 50 years shows, you know, changes a lot. There's a period of quiescence and then a big increase in strikes and then decrease, up, down, and then down to the present period. In the strike wave that occurred that began in the late 60s and lasted for up to even 10 years in some countries, you saw in many countries a coincidence of political strikes and industrial conflict. Both occurred at the same time. And there are countries that record where you wouldn't have to code strikes because they're already coded for you as political.
In Italy, for example.
Yeah, yeah. So, and And so those two things went up and down together. If political strikes are useful to show that you're strong, then, and if they're cheap, which I think they are, because you can certainly take the workers out for 2 hours in a political strike,
Right.
why not use them all the time?
Right. Well, the first answer is kind of a tautological one I'll come back to in a second, is that maybe not all unions are capable of taking their workers out on strike ever, or they're just not strong at that moment. Why that might be the case or why that might vary, I think, is the more interesting question. But to the second point about what you see in other countries, what I think is different about what we're looking at here is that we're looking down at the level of the individual bargaining unit. And what I've seen, at least in the stuff I've read, that it does deal mainly with Italy and to some extent France and other places, but primarily Italy is what I've seen, is it's strikes that are being called by the national level federations, typically involved, and they are trying to actually make a demand on the government. I think that's qualitatively and importantly different in some regard.
But they're the same people who do the contract negotiations there. They don't have plant level or decentralized
and
contract
that was
negotiations.
varying in that same time period in Italy, for example. In some places, at one point in time, they were doing it, then it got more centralized in the late 60s, early 70s, and then it kind of changed away again. So there was covariance in that same time window, at least in Italy. But the point I was just simply trying to make is that one union going out on strike by itself is unlikely to have any realistic chance or even idea that they're going to actually change policy. But if you have a centralized federation that is calling, whether they're bargaining for everyone or not, who's calling everybody out and they're coming, it's on a scale that now you plausibly have a more realistic chance of actually changing policy. And what's more, they're protesting the government on policies that are directly related to the workers. The Italian federations were calling on workers on political strikes to fight changes in labor law or to demand changes in labor law or to demand indexation of wage contracts or extension to non-union workers. They're demanding changes on economic issues of direct relevance to workers. They're not out there saying, kick the United States Air Force bases out of Italy, for example. They're not protesting on things that are not directly related to workers. And the things we're trying to give examples of at the moment are things that are not plausibly related to their immediate interests. So the ILWU going out on strike to demand a higher minimum wage, that would be a harder one to code, right? Because that may not, and obviously ILWU workers are not working minimum wage jobs, but that is kind of more directly within their purview. But the IRLE obviously is not, and they have a history of doing things that are not in their purview. Now to go back to your question about, well, why don't all unions do this? All unions are not strong enough to call these strikes, and that goes back to the bigger question of what is it about the combination of leadership and internal rules that enable some unions to call these types of strikes and others to not? And just say, what can we say that might give us purchase on what makes unions strong in this sense and not? And that's the kind of larger research project. So I can give you a series of things we think are interesting, but I can't answer that question for you right now. But for example, take Teamsters under Jimmy Hoffa, strong union at the time, completely unwilling to ever call anything political, ever. And it's not even clear he could have. He had woken up one morning 3 weeks before a big Teamster long-haul trucking contract expiration and said, we're going to go out and protest the Vietnam War. I just can't see the Teamsters doing it. And I don't have a good answer as the whole series of variables that would explain that, but that's kind of the way of thinking that would explain why all unions, even all strong unions, don't take these kinds of strikes. 1, 2, 3, sorry. Yeah.
Well, you said it early on, and I'm going to ask you to explain to me, how come the employers don't know if the union is strong or weak? I'm presuming, aside from being in the leadership, there's lots of other people who could be informers and they would get the information. So how is that? And secondly, how strong is strong enough? And the third question, and you can answer any part you want to, is about the NRA. What did they do if it was an illegal strike to do that against political strikes?
Right. So clearly the employer has some beliefs about whether the union is strong or weak. And where they get this information, it could come from all manner of places. And they have better information at one point in time than at another. Like, that's absolutely the case. But I would still maintain that the strong union members and the leadership have a better idea of their willingness to fight than the employer ever will. And certainly better than I ever will, like as just an outside guy looking at
I'm
it.
not talking about you.
So this goes back to the notion of a repeated game, that these are bargaining pairs that have bargained repeatedly over time, and they have some sort of notion that in general the union is capable or not, or these types of things. But still, there are times when, if you've ever seen or been part of or read the minutes of an ILW convention, a very strong union, you would think that it's actually organized like warfare internally. I mean, to the point where you would not imagine that this organization could actually mount a coherent strike ever. There's that level of internal political fighting going on all the time. So if you have an informer, presumably they're from one faction or another, and they're saying, no, the union's going down, because, they're reporting to PMA because so-and-so is a terrible leader and no one believes him, well, the union somehow gets over that. I forgot your...
NRA.
The NLRA.
NLRA.
So why, well, this is kind of the standard problem with anything dealing with labor law in the United States, is that if there's no, you don't go to the criminal courts, right? You go to the labor relations machinery here. So in order for the PMA to protest this or claim it was illegal, they have to go to the NLRA, file a petition that this was an illegal work stoppage, which then gets taken to a labor arbitrator who then makes a decision, which can then be appealed, and it goes on and on and on and on. I actually do not know if they did. That's a good question.
So nothing happened.
Nothing happened. Nothing formal happened. Whether they filed something or not is an interesting question, and I should look into that, but I don't know the answer.
Thank you.
Well, she asked one of my questions, but my other one, a small point. There's something else happening in May 2008, which doesn't seem to be taken into account. In some ways, the Iraq War was within the purview of unions, and that was the election or the run-up, the primary, where the Iraq War at that point in the primary was the issue between the Democrats and the Republicans, and certainly labor was interested in having a Democratic president. So, it's not clear to me. It seems to me that there's many factors that are determining, and it's not quite as pure as
Right. So this is kind of related to Ken's point, where there are lots of things going on. That's actually a plausible one, and if you're interested enough, so May, remember the Democratic primary hadn't been decided yet necessarily.
right,
And
but both,
ILWU
there
did
was
endorse.
the difference between the Democrats and the Republicans, even though the primary hadn't been decided.
Well, there's also a difference between Hillary and Barack,
Yeah.
that Barack was really
Yeah.
going after Hillary for her behavior and vote for the
Right.
Iraq War, and the ILWU turns out endorsed Barack Obama. So
Right.
it's
Yeah.
there's
so
these
all-
other things going on that are very plausible, and I see them as once again all these things that would make it more auspicious for them to do this in 2008 than in 2007. They didn't shut down the ports in 2007, even though there was still an Iraq War then, and the union was presumably just as opposed to it then as it was in 2008. So I'm not just counting it all. I think that's an important consideration. So a kind of technical answer, we can go back and try to incorporate these types of things in the statistical models if we want to incorporate this over a longer time horizon. Or to go with Ken's idea, if we wanted to write just the story of this one work stoppage, we'd have to gather more information on how or if that came into play. I actually, talking to the union people, no one has mentioned to me anything about the presidential politics being part of their decision to do that. Not that they were ignorant that it had relationships to it, but that wasn't why people were bringing it up at that moment. But that's just a couple people that have told me stories. So Ron, and then, sorry, I'm trying to.
Why would a political strike in your model send a stronger signal than a standard issue warning strike? Again, I'm thinking like railway engineers in Germany, where the standard thing coming up to contract negotiations is to call a couple of short warning strikes specifically as a signal. We can pull everybody out.
Right.
And in that case, particularly, there was doubt because the mainstream union was opposed to the stoppage and the employers, of course, were opposed to the stoppage, and they sent a very strong signal, and it worked. So why, other than being a little more costly, conceivably, or if Dan's right, a little less costly, why would the political strike be the weapon of choice?
Well, it's not necessarily as clear that it would be the only weapon of choice,
Okay.
right? So there's other things the union can do to signal, and they do them all the time. So things like going to other unions and getting declarations of support in advance. Like, if we strike, will you help us out, kind of thing. Or taking preemptive strike authorization votes before they enter into negotiations. These types of signaling things happen all the time. There's lots of ways they can occur. The question is, does this type of strike have that characteristic that other types of strikes may also? So why would they choose to do a political strike rather than just everyone takes a really long lunch on that day? Well, I think part of it has to do with, and this is kind of the fuzzier part of the sets of arguments we're dealing with. This is really having to do with the ability or the necessity of coordinating politically across the different parts of this union. And this is a way for them to develop an internal focal point to do so. And so one of the things I've heard about this particular strike is one of the big uncertainties within the union was the extent to which the Southern California locals would participate. Because it was views coming out of Northern California, the kind of impetus for this particular strike, particularly the political nature of it. And it turns out the Southern California locals had also just participated in a big march just a couple weeks earlier for all the LA County unions who had contracts expiring in 2008. So would they do this again kind of thing? It turns out they did. So Margaret's been making this argument, and she and I go back and forth, and she's like, well, maybe there's some sort of internal, this is a way for the leader to learn about his own membership's willingness to fight in a relatively costless, or less costly way than he might otherwise. I think there's something to that. That's gonna be a harder one to differentiate from what we're having. But I think that's plausible. You have a question in the back as well.
Yes, just as a member of the general public
Right.
on that. You see a certain receptiveness in the nation to the future of unions. For example, the auto union. I would say if you took a poll of the United States, most people would not feel bad about General Motors and others going into bankruptcy to get rid of these high union wages, packages, and of course bondholders and all the other problems.
Right.
But union would be one of the problems that they've won a lot and poor results. We now have on the front page of the LA Times today a big story about the Service Employees Union opposing investigation of prisoners who were locked up supposedly for years and been getting checks from the state of California for caring in-home for their relatives. Outright fraud and all sorts of cases with this union, which has already lost many major cases on fraud. Would this not be a good political stance, at least on unions in California, to get the public back in tune that unions can be a great positive force? For the unions to say, hey, the state can't afford the investigation, we'll pay for it. If a union is fraudulent, hey, let's give 1 day of wages and get these people investigated. Show the power of the union moving towards positive things, not just protecting wages and benefits.
Yeah, I think so. So the broader issue, I think, is exactly the kind of thing we've been talking about the whole year I've been here. This is what can unions do that you could actually get a union to do that might also have broader appeal, right? So this is one example, the Iraq War. There, maybe not everyone agrees with the union. I'm sure they don't, obviously, but there's a large swath of people, particularly on the West Coast, who were very much opposed to the Iraq War, particularly by the time 2008 rolled around. And by doing this, it's in a situation where they're able to take broader issues more visibly. We talked about the SEIU and their work with education and so forth. Now, to get a union to fund an investigation into another union, I think is very unlikely for a whole host of reasons. It may endear them to some members of the public, but I think whatever benefit that would get them would be overshadowed by whatever they'd have to pay within the union. But the notion that there's lots of bad press about unions is undeniable. And the notion that many Americans have less than favorable opinions of unions is also true. So unions being able to do more positive things, it may not be investigating other unions, but might be other types of involvement. I think it's something that we would all say is something we should be trying to figure out how to make more of that happen. Chris, you have a question?
I mean, I would add that although there's a lot of negative attitudes towards unions, it's still true that substantial majorities of non-union workers would like a union. So, at least for their own interest, they'd like to have a union there. I realized when I introduced John, I forgot to say two important things. One is that he's going to be leaving us in June, but in September heading to Florida State University for a teaching job in political science. And he's also the first colloquium speaker to have his mom show up for the colloquium.
Yes.
And so I want to welcome. But I wanted to sort of follow up on Kent and Miriam's questions about ILW exceptionalism.
Right.
Because I'm just wondering if it's not just a question of that there are some unions for whom this wouldn't be true, but is there any other union I mean, is there any other union that's done political strikes since 1948 or so? And for that matter, most unions aren't striking at all since the 1970s. So I guess there's a question about to what extent would you expect this to be generalizable in a useful way, or is the real question the one that you've come back to a couple of times about what makes this union different?
Well, the reason why we ended up asking this question is because we had this pre-existing question
Yeah.
of what makes this union different, right? And so we came across this stuff, and this seemed like an interesting argument. And then when we try to go and make, when we try to say the ILWU is different, it has these commitments, it does these things, people always ask why or how, and where the rubber really hits the road in people's minds is what do unions do with strikes? And so we said, okay, what does the ILWU do with strikes in terms of politics? They all do all manner of other stuff. They give money, they support this, they support that. Other unions do as well. But we thought this was the all right, if you really want to pay attention, when do they stop work? Like that's the fun. If people think of unions and stopping work, then when do they do that? So that's why we're focusing on this here. To the extent to which it generalizes outside the ILWU is, I just find that an empirical question, frankly. And we happen to have a convenient, well, we thought more convenient than it's turned out to be, a way to get data of a level of granularity necessary to explore this with these bargaining pair. So it may work with this bargaining pair, but whether it generalizes is still unclear. I think Miriam's point about does it work in other countries is not a trivial one, because you have to deal with what are the institutions and the level at which bargaining takes place that may make this tool less valuable or more valuable. Or it just may mean that they have more political power and they're actually, in fact, trying to change policy directly, which is something we're assuming that the ILWU cannot do. We're assuming that they cannot, they prefer to have no Iraq war, but they cannot meaningfully affect that. Ultimately, maybe through an election of a Democratic president who ultimately pulls us out, fine, but that aside, it still has nothing to do with their wages directly. So, in terms of other unions doing these things, I mean, we're looking at a couple others that have had this kind of history. Interestingly enough, we're trying to restrict it to the transport sector, which doesn't get away from this notion of being strategically placed. But the waterside workers in Australia have been extremely politically militant over long periods of time, very much like the ILWU. Parts of the Teamsters union were, so one of the things we're doing is we're comparing locals and the Teamsters. If you look at the locals of Detroit and Minneapolis back in the 30s and 40s, where you had Trotskyist leaders in Minneapolis and you had Hoffa in Detroit, and the parallel developments there, there's something to be said, broadly speaking, about the political activities of unions and their political commitments, but not so much necessarily about political strikes and contracts, necessarily. So, I guess, I hope that kind of answers your question. Yeah. You had your hand up for a while, sorry.
I just wondered if you, and forgive me if you went over this in what you controlled for, but looked at the strength of the broader social movements that were happening at the time these political strikes made.
The short answer is no. I mean, that's, once again, I think to Ken's point about this, left is strong, left is weak, it's fighting with itself, it's not. There's certain issues that are coordinating for the left, like Vietnam or civil rights. Other times, there's the exact opposite. There's 50 things and they're all fighting each other. So, we haven't done that directly. And that might be a good thing to do, but I think more interesting is who's fighting over what in the ILWU. There's to say, can we pull out, within all these political factions in the union, can we find one issue or set of issues that the union itself can coordinate on? And the Iraq War is an obvious one now. So they also have all these other things. They shut down the ports for the WTO ministerial in Seattle in 1999. They shut down the ports over Mumia Abu Jamal's execution or death sentence that might have been in 1999 as well. In any event, they've taken these varieties of stands, political activities, over things that, how they come to that direct issue, or if that even matters, is I think a question that going into the story of any particular strike would help us understand more about.
Well, I would just jump in and say, controlling for who's president of the ILWU does periodize it into sort of chunks that may then, you may be able to match up with sort of what was going on.
It does, it does. The problem, the one problem with that is that Harry Bridges covers such a huge part of that chunk. But even with all the problems with this, and even with all the data issues that we're having, and the fact that, I'm very skeptical of the robustness of the statistical work at the moment. But I'm just, what is it? Given what we have, can we see anything at all? So the fact that I see anything at all, I find a little surprising, to be honest. When we had, so the ones I showed you didn't have anything for the ILWU president there because that was only 10 years and Harry Bridges was president at the time, so you can't do that. When we try to branch it out and just do the probability of a strike in a particular quarter, what we see is all presidents after Harry Bridges have a lower probability of having political strikes. Some of them are just statistically distinguishable from him, some aren't. Part of that has to do with how long they were president, you know. So for example, Dave Arian, we can't distinguish his political strike behavior from Harry Bridges, which is partially not surprising due to his politics, but also he was only president for 4 years. Harry Bridges was president for 30, he didn't have any opportunities. James Spinoza, some of these people are president a little bit longer, it's a little bit more robust when we can discern that. But the fact that even you can see a president effect, if you will, is interesting for our larger argument of what's the role of a leader and what's the role of an organization in perpetuating
But
itself.
how can you distinguish that from the fact that strikes in general were falling in that period?
You have to have time trend in it, and that's, I played around with some time trend variables and models, but at this point, like I said, this is purely like, I'm gonna run a couple of regressions and see what pops out initially, and then once I feel like my effort's better spent on the data than on calculating the exact optimal time trend for suboptimal data. That's where I'm stuck at the moment. So it's kind of more of a, it will be done one day to like deal with these things, but at the moment, this is purely a suggestive kind of,
But you can also put in some kind of overall strike rate, which is,
I would do,
it's
yeah.
not a pure time trend.
It's a matter of calculating the probability of an industrial conflict by this union
right.
compared with the probability of a strike by
Yeah.
any random union.
Right, so, I mean, so you can just do a lag 5-year average or quantity of, you know, man hours lost to work stoppages, or you can even do it within the industry if you wanted. I mean, I think you can get that level of data from the BLS. So yeah, I will not sit here and try to defend the statistical models in any way optimal or final product, purely suggestive and interesting at this point is really all I'm willing to say.
Thanks, John.